able to figure out how to close it. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth part of our webinar series out of 5, focused on disability justice and sexual violence prevention. This is a collaborative project that has been created through work between the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the Multicultural Efforts to End Sexual Assault, the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault, and the Indiana Minority Health Coalition. Sorry for the little bit of delay in beginning. We just wanted to make sure that we were able to record this for folks who can't attend. And anyway, so we're ready to get started. Today, my name is Skye Ashton Kantola, and one of my collaborators, Jody Powers, will both be co-presenters on this webinar focused on best practices for working with people with disabilities. And we both just wanted to give brief introductions and a little bit of context. So as I've mentioned in previous webinars, I'm the program coordinator for the Multicultural Efforts to End Sexual Assault, or MESA. And today I'm also going to be assisting Jody in communicating, and I just wanted to acknowledge that typically Cierra, one of our other collaborators from ICADV, assists Jody with communication, and she wasn't able to attend today, and so this will be mine and Jody's first time working together. And so we wanted to acknowledge that it might be a little bit challenging at the beginning as we build more up into sync with each other, but that's okay. And we also just want to model what it looks like to work together, particularly when we might have competing disabilities. For example, I have some sensory processing difficulties. So, yeah, I'll just leave it there. And do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
My name is Jody Powers.
My name is Jody Powers.
And I'm an independent disability consultant.
And I'm an independent disability advocate. Person.
Yeah. CONSULTANT.
Sorry.
CONSUL.
Consul. Consulate.
Anyway, I'm an independent disability
Consultant.
Yeah.
Yes, so she said, anyway, I am an independent disability consultant.
Yeah. And I have cerebral palsy.
I have cerebral palsy.
And I'm a little bit blind.
And I'm a little bit blind.
Little me. And I'm little me. L-E-D-N-N. L-E below. Below, I'm blind. Little me.
Literally?
No. L-E-Z-N-N.
L-E-Z?
No. I'm living below. Below. Big one. Bang. L-E-Z-A-L-L.
L-E-Z.
And I'm visually impaired.
I'm visually impaired.
Yes. Let's say sad.
As I've told Skye.
It's okay.
It's okay.
If we are a bit outward.
If we're a little bit out of sync.
Outward.
Out.
If we are a little bit outward.
Awkward.
Yeah.
If we're a little bit awkward.
It really is okay.
It's okay.
Yeah, and then I'm so happy to be here.
And I'm so happy to be here.
From now,
because
from now,
from now,
from now,
oh, before now,
most of presenters,
most of the presenters
have more hidden disabilities.
Have had more hidden disabilities.
I love that you are able to see my outwardness.
And so you're able to see me.
But I love that you are able to see my outwardness.
And so I love that you're able to see my awkwardness.
My my outward struggle.
And see me struggle.
Yeah. But because it was okay.
Because it's really okay.
I know many of us are terrible.
And nothing about us is
okay. It's okay. I know many of us.
And many of us
are terrible.
Are uncomfortable
around people with disabilities.
Around people with different disabilities.
Visible. Yes.
Visible disabilities.
This is a good opportunity for you to get used to some of the awkwardness.
So this is an opportunity for you to work with some of the awkwardness.
Yeah. Let's get done.
Okay, let's get going. So some of the stuff that we wanted to try to discuss with you today are first just give you a basis in understanding ableism and how it relates to best practices in working with people with disabilities and how it contributes to violence prevention or contributes to violence that people with disabilities may often experience. We also want to kind of break down best practices into a few different fields that do often overlap. So we're not saying these are the only ways to think about best practices. We just wanted to find a way to break down information in a way that would be more easily digestible for folks. Then we have a few closing things. So the best practice areas we want to discuss today are interpersonal best practices, professional and employment best practices, and then medical and social services. And then I just briefly wanted to remind folks that this is part of a whole series, and so we have one more, I almost said episode like we're doing a podcast, but we have one more webinar on September 26th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time that kind of culminates all of the webinars we've done into a webinar on preventing violence against people with disabilities. I'm not going to go into this slide heavily. I just wanted to mention, since you'll be able to receive the slides after we're done, that we tried to culminate what disability justice is in a slide, and that our focus on disability justice is around a social movement led and created by people with disabilities, and that it's not just about physical accessibility or policies, but also a really holistic view of how people with disabilities can be a valued part of society and have all of our needs met, and how this obviously prevents violence. I wanted to take a brief moment before we actually get into the topic to address some feedback we've gotten up to this point in the first 3 webinars. And that is, we've had a few folks ask us why we would take time to specifically talk about people of color with disabilities or queer and trans folks with disabilities. Some people are concerned that this creates division or somehow detracts from what we're talking about. And so I just wanted to clarify that the reason that this is really important for us to discuss is because people who are living at those intersections of marginalization are already aware of and are already discussing how their experience might be different For example, the experience of a person of color with disabilities might be different than a white person with disabilities. And so it's really important for us to be having those conversations, especially in professional and service provision areas, because people are already addressing them, and we have a responsibility to our communities to make sure that we're doing the most rigorous and effective and holistic work possible. Do you want to add anything?
I just told that the person within the disability community.
What within the disability community?
We want to show disability.
We want to center disability?
We want to show the disability.
I'm not catching the beginning.
We want to show.
We must.
We want to show us HOW.
We must show.
We want to.
We want to? Yes.
Show.
We want to show.
The disability.
So that everyone can see.
We want to show the diversity.
The diversity.
Of people within the disability community.
Yeah, we want to show the diversity within the disability community. Yeah, and part of what I want to build on what Jody just said is what we have on the slide is that disability intersects with every marginalized group. And so, you know, people of color, queer folks, undocumented people, anyone in these other communities, or wealthy white people can experience disability. So it really cuts across every other marginalized group. And we also know statistically that people who experience multiple kinds of marginalization tend to also experience higher rates and risks for violence because of historically rooted power structures. So to give a very brief statistical example for folks, there was a really incredible 2011 survey done called Injustice at Every Turn that showed that for trans folks, about 15% of transgender people who are incarcerated experience sexual assault either from inmates or guards. But if you look specifically at Black transgender people, the rate goes up to something about 30 to 35%. And so the problem is not necessarily with the person's gender or race, but specifically that because of these historically and social rooted power structures that people are more easily victimized by people in positions of power. And then there is a meme at the bottom of this slide, and it is pink background, and it says, "You have survived every single bad day so far." And so I wanted to also introduce that for this webinar, I wanted to really connect disability community culture to what we're talking about. Very often when fields like disability justice become more professionalized, they actually get a little bit divorced from the actual community. And so I'm going to have a variety of memes for us to talk about and how it relates to different communities and people with disabilities. And I will, similar to like I just did, give a verbal explanation of what the meme is so that I can make sure that people have a few different ways that they can access the content and make sure that everyone's able to be with us in what we're talking about. So we're going to move on to a section that focuses on the understanding ableism, or what Jody called earlier, facing ableism, and how this relates to violence prevention.
Ableism is the discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities.
Ableism is a prejudice against people with disabilities.
And discrimination.
And what?
Discrimination.
Discrimination. Yeah.
People with disabilities.
Yeah, ableism is the discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities.
It is actually the belief that disabled people are not as important as able-bodied people.
Yeah, it's the belief that disabled people are not as important as able-bodied people.
So it is important to talk about this.
So it's important to talk about this.
We know what to divide people.
Because we know what?
We know what to divide people.
So that we know what divides people.
No. We don't want.
We don't want this to divide people.
No. But it's important to have conversation.
So it's important.
It is listening. It is important. Oh, that's my kind of thought.
Lost your train of thought?
Yeah. It is important to talk about content.
It's important because it's part of.
You know what? It is important for us to have conversation.
It's important for us to have these hard conversations.
Because this is how we learn from one another.
Because this is how we learn from one another.
It makes me hard to it makes me hard to talk about the discrimination.
It might be hard to talk about ableism.
It makes me hard to talk about the discrimination.
It might be hard to talk about discrimination.
With people with disabilities.
Against people with disabilities.
But it is real.
But it is real.
It is time to talk about it.
And it's time to talk about it.
And unemployed.
And unemployed.
And unemployed.
And it's.
We need to talk about it in an honest way.
Oh, we need to talk about it in an honest way.
Yeah, I have to need to talk about it because if we want to talk about it.
It's also important to talk about if we want to stop violence.
We need to address the root of it.
We need to address the root of it, or like the root of violence.
And also, if we want to have less help.
And if we work to have less,
we also want, if we want to deal with that help.
We need to. We need to build relationships.
If we want to build that help.
If we
want to build with that help.
Build relationships.
We need to address everything in our own life.
If we want to build relationships, we have to address ableism in our own lives.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Ableism can be subtle.
Ableism can be subtle.
Or obvious.
Or
Socially endorsed.
Or societally endorsed.
We all have some form of ableism.
We all have some form of ableism.
We just need to be brave about it.
But let's be brave about it.
And own it. So that we will be able to deal with it.
So that we're able to deal with it.
I have struggled with ableism in my own life.
I've struggled with ableism in my own life.
There was a time in my life. That I did not want to. I didn't want anything to do
that I didn't want to have anything to do
with people with disabilities.
with different kinds of
With
disabilities.
people with disabilities.
I'm not catching it.
People with disabilities. INTELL.
Oh, internal?
Disabilities.
Intellectual.
Disabilities.
Okay, so there was a time in my life when I didn't want to have anything to do with people with intellectual disabilities.
Because it was believed that our betterment it was believed that our betterment was that wrong.
Because lots of people believed.
No, it was believed.
You believed?
It was believed
It was your belief
that our betterment was that wrong.
that you were better than what they were.
Yeah. And there was this time I saw how people treated me.
And I saw how people treated me.
And they believed that if I had an individual disability.
And they believed that I have an intellectual disability.
If they believe.
Oh, and if they believe that I have an intellectual disability.
They treated me badly.
That they would treat me badly.
Because of that reason, I was in the victim town.
And so because of that reason, I didn't want to have anything to do
with
them.
Yeah. And that's wrong of me.
And that was wrong of me.
From me, and now, but because I was able to admit it,
because I am
I was able to be brave.
And because I'm able to be brave.
I was able,
was able to
own it.
To own it.
I was able to address it.
And I was able to address it.
I mean, own it. I know that there is no difference between me and someone with an individual disability.
Now I know that there's not a difference between me and someone with an intellectual disability.
My other that.
I know that.
My other that.
My
enjoy that. Because I am brave.
Because I am brave.
Brave. That's because my other that.
Your intellect?
Does not give me more value.
Does not make me more valuable
than anyone else.
And
because I was able to get that.
Because I was able to get that.
Now I'm able to have relationships.
Now I'm able to have relationships.
And I would have missed out on that.
And sorry, I didn't catch you.
I would have missed out.
I would have missed out on that.
If I didn't address my own ableism.
If I didn't address my own ableism.
And that's what it is so much.
And that's.
Unless it's so much us.
That's why I wanna.
Unless it's so much.
I'm not catching. Encourage. Oh, encourage. That's why I want to encourage this.
No.
Oh.
Unless it's so much us.
Encourage us.
So that own it.
Just own it.
Yes. Hey, can you tell us about some of the ableism you handle address in this?
Yeah, so Jody asked me if I have a story about internalized ableism that I would like to share with us.
Oh,
Or like externalized?
yeah.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah, so we wanted to just give a couple of examples of how ableism can impact people in a very real life way. So I also wanted to give us an example of how even anybody can perpetuate ableism. So one of the ways that I had done this a while back was I had a friend who had a personality disorder, and not because of the personality disorder, but because of just their own problems, they had very poor boundaries. And at the time, I attributed the things that they were doing and their actions and behaviors with the mental illness and personality disorder, instead of saying, this is one facet of who you are, and regardless of ability or disability, that people should be able to work on their boundaries together. So instead, I ended up calling this person names, and a few years later when I moved to Indiana, I made friends with somebody who had the same disability and had told them this, and they came out to me in that moment that they also had this disability. And I was shocked because I didn't know that they had it. And I think that that's a really common assumptions that people have, that everyone with a kind of disability will look the same, will act the same, or that each kind of disability has like a universal story. And becoming friends with that person first also helped me understand the ways that, like Jody just said, that ableism would have prevented me from having that really amazing relationship if I hadn't come to terms with understanding the ways that I was promoting that. And I have learned from that, and I hope to continue learning.
and ableism can ultimately knowing that.
You want me to share another one of internalized?
No, and that's one. When you was pick it.
Whenever we pick it?
When you was
Why? Are you asking me to read it?
it.
Okay. Yeah. Which one? The ableism, the obvious?
No. No.
What we should know about ableism? Yeah. Wait, we already did read this.
The second one.
Oh, ableism can be internalized.
Yes. And hey, and that.
You want me to give another example of internalized?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess a brief example of internalized ableism is when I first became chronically ill about a decade ago, I went to doctors and told them that I was very lazy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anyone who knows me, I worked several jobs. Like, I've never been lazy. I was actually just severely chronically ill, but I didn't have that language. And the language that society had supplied me with was, if you can't be productive in the way that people expect, that just means you're lazy. And so it took me many years to come to terms with and realize that sometimes I just can't do something if I'm too sick. And that has helped me have a much more loving and productive, ironically, relationship with my own body and my own work.
Really, I believe that I was abandoned.
For me, I believe that I was
Abandoned. I was abandoned. Abandoned. Abandoned.
A burden.
Oh,
Yes.
a burden.
Yes. And because of that, I thought that I always had to be positive.
And because I believed I was a burden, I thought I always had to be positive.
To make up for being a burden.
To make up for being a burden.
Yeah. And I was doing that is not true.
And obviously that's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Yeah. Everything can be obvious.
So ableism can be obvious. So this slide talks about the National Crime Victimization Survey in the US. from the Bureau of Justice shows that people with disabilities are at least 2.5 times more likely to experience violence than those without disabilities. And then there's a book called Disability Hate Crimes, Does Anyone Really Hate Disabled People by Mark Sherry. And in that book, he documents that there are numerous cases of violence against people with disabilities.
I believe that autumn this hello.
What'd you see?
And that, yeah.
Oh, next slide. So this is focusing on subtle forms of ableism. Do you want me to read this?
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of examples are that many houses are very inaccessible, and that actually creates a really community-wide sense of isolation, particularly for those with physical disabilities, and that there can be deep connections are typically forged outside of public arenas. And that the absence of public and accessible restrooms communicates that the basic needs of disabled people are not as important.
Yeah. Well, and I had to stay with the
Disability?
I had to stay with you. I had to stay with you.
Accessibility.
Oh, accessibility
Issues.
is lost.
Issues.
Issues, accessibility issues.
More than about, and more about buildings.
Are more than just about buildings.
It's about what is community.
It's about community,
What is community?
what it communicates.
Yeah. So that's why we are so well, I had to do with it, manuals, so that disability community.
So what accessibility communicates is,
That we manual.
yeah, that we matter.
Yeah. No. And that's why we need to put money into that.
That we matter.
That's why we need to put money into it.
I'm not catching this.
Money.
Money?
You need to put money into it.
Yeah, we need to put money into
Because people matter.
because people matter.
Yeah. And the next time. And the next time.
Yeah, the next slide.
Nursing homes
Nursing homes
can be and there's a demo of Ableism.
can be an example of societal ableism.
That's because the hardening of hell.
Because it's hard to tell. Oh, sorry.
The people in nursing homes
The people in nursing homes
who have people with amputate,
have people to
amputate,
amputate,
to amputate.
Advocate.
Oh, advocate. Yeah, have people to advocate.
On the behalf.
Yeah, they don't have people to advocate.
No.
Oh,
If they do.
okay. If people in nursing homes had people to advocate.
No.
Sorry.
One, the people who do.
The people who do have someone to advocate.
Receive better help.
Receive better care in nursing homes.
Yeah. The people who don't.
Than people who don't.
And what we are saying.
And so what we're saying
is manual.
Is it shouldn't matter.
Because people matter.
Because people matter.
Yes. And yeah. And it's frustrating that we're not always seeing that.
And it's frustrating that we're not always seen that way.
Yeah. And
Okay, so yeah, part of our point here is just that by using some of the best practices we're going to talk about, we can help eliminate ableism and create disability justice. And one of the things I wanted to add to what Jody explained here is that that eliminating ableism, contributing to disability justice, and doing violence prevention starts with us as individuals, but as we work on eliminating our own ableism and doing this kind of advocacy work, we can, you know, impact and change larger systems and the institutions that we're in.
yes.
So just briefly, whenever we talk about best practices, we're talking about language, actions, and processes that are known to have either the greatest positive impacts and or the least negative impacts on people with disabilities. And that a lot of what we're going to recommend is based primarily on perspectives of people with disabilities, and that a lot of what is central to our discussion is the concept of universal design. I added a link here for people to explore after the webinar at some point, but basically universal design means how can we create everything from spatial to social settings where people have the most access to the space or whatever else we're discussing. So often universal design is talked about in terms of architectural terms and how buildings are literally built, but universal design can also be like, how can we have the most access and opportunities for communication differences and things like that. And then obviously best practices, we're trying to give you like a general idea in this very short webinar. But obviously these types of best practices may vary by other intersecting identities, and sometimes people just have competing needs. A really easy example is like sensory stuff. So for myself, as somebody who hears and sees kind of too much, my needs to have dimmer lights or quieter settings might compete with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing or who has visual impairments or other differing sensory needs than me. So these can vary a lot by person and by community and other things. And then briefly, we just wanted to mention that we're trying to talk about lots of different kinds of disabilities, and again, that best practices may differ by specific disabilities. Very generally, we're kind of looking at developmental and cognitive disabilities, neurodivergence, and mental illness. And then also not secondarily in terms of like hierarchy, but just additionally, mobility and physical disabilities. And so some examples of neurodivergence and developmental disabilities might include autism, Down syndrome, deafness, traumatic brain injury, personality disorders, and plural systems, for people who don't know, is kind of a communal word or communal language for people who have dissociative identity disorder, or what some people in medical industries call multiple personalities. The communal word for that is usually plural systems or multiple systems. And then for mobility and physical disabilities, these might include things like cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, visual impairment, muscular dystrophy, and chronic illnesses. And the important thing that we want to convey here is that there's so many different ways to classify and think about disabilities. You know, even in deaf communities, for example, sometimes people think of deafness not as a disability, or some people think of it more in the social construct of disability as a physical disability, or specifically as neurodivergence. So even within these communities, there's different ways to think about these things, and we're not trying to suggest that this is the best way or the only way at all. The meme that I have up here is a meme that comes primarily from autistic communities and people with dyspraxia, and it says, writing things on my hand so I won't forget. And on the left picture panel, there's a person with a hand barely out of a long sleeve, and on the right panel, the sleeve has been pulled up and they've written left hand on their hand. And that's kind of, it's humorous to people with dyspraxia because a lot of us have difficulty remembering left and right. My partner likes to remind me of this often when I'm driving and he says, go left, and I turn right. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and go into interpersonal best practices. So our first area that we wanted to discuss was conversation. So this seems very obvious, and I feel like hopefully people listening in will know this, but please speak to adults as adults. there's so many times if people speak differently or they don't communicate verbally, or any number of other things, that people are spoken to as if, or also particularly folks who are in wheelchairs are often spoken to as if the person is a child.
This is a testament to both those of us with communication problems.
This can be especially big issue for people with communication troubles.
That it is better to assume
It's better not to assume.
that the it's better to assume
It's better to assume
that people are able to.
It's better to assume that people are able to understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah. So in thinking about conversation, I really want us to think about something that Jody brought up earlier, which is that intelligence as an idea in society is assumed that there's like one single type of intelligence, or that there should be one type of intelligence everyone should aspire to. And just remembering that people who process things differently or more slowly, or people who have different communication styles, it doesn't reflect their intelligence. I don't even know what intelligence really means, except what people expect people to be able to cognitively function in a certain way. So I want to argue or debate with folks that intelligence in and of itself is an ableist concept, and that instead just recognizing that everyone communicates differently and understands things differently, and if we just have a little bit of patience with each other, we can go a lot farther in actually communicating and building relationships. And so if you're unsure that someone needs something or what they're doing, it's okay to ask if it's related to a relationship that you have. So for example, if you're in a doctor's office and the person has disclosed a disability, and as a doctor, you're probably not going to understand every disability or health issue there is in the entire world. And so it's okay to say, oh, I'm not very familiar with that. Can you tell me about that? And then just respect how the person communicates about that, and if they don't want to explain something. I included a few other examples. Another is, so something from autistic communities, there's a quote, you just said you're flapping, in quotes. I'm not sure what that means. Would you be willing to tell me more? So those are just some examples of ways that you can ask for clarification if you're not sure what someone said or what they're doing.
And also, if you don't understand someone,
and if you don't understand someone,
it really is okay to ask them to repeat themselves.
It's really okay to ask them to repeat themselves.
And it's not a good idea.
And I'm not as...
It is not a good idea.
Oh, it's not as big a deal.
No.
It's not a good idea.
Oh. It's not a good idea.
To pretend that you understand.
It's not a good idea to pretend that you understand.
Because really, we know the difference.
Because really, we know the difference.
Yeah. And it's okay to ask people to slow down.
And it's okay to ask people to slow down.
Yeah. And don't be afraid.
Yeah, don't be afraid.
To push into a relationship.
To push into a relationship. A couple of other concepts around best practices for conversation. Please remember that some folks have difficulty with metaphors and indirect language. And so, especially if you're trying to do something together or asking questions, it's better to try to be explicit and concrete. I have several memes about metaphors and indirect language. So also, just as a note, for folks who don't know, a lot of people see The Office and Parks and Recreation, which is where two of these memes have come from. A lot of people headcanon many of these characters as neurodivergent. So headcanon just means the producers of the show have not explicitly said the folks or the characters are neurodivergent, but a lot of people in the community see them that way and really enjoy the shows from those perspectives. So one of the memes is Tom Haverford from Parks and Recreation, and he says, "Whenever Leslie asks me for the Latin names of any of our plants, I just give her the names of rappers. Those ludicrouses are coming in great." Okay, so this is a moment where the person he's spoken to has no idea that he's being silly or ridiculous or not literal, right? And so there's like a silly moment of miscommunication happening there. Another example from The Office says, Michael Scott, the head of The Office, says, "I would like your undivided attention." And Dwight says, "You couldn't handle my undivided attention." Again, like a very literal response to what the person was asking was not actually responded to directly or what they needed. And to give a final personal example, today I was driving to Muncie, where we're doing the metaphor today, or doing the webinar today. And I was on the phone with a service professional, and he kept trying to explain to me that there were lots of different options for what I was calling about. And I kept thinking, I kept asking him repeatedly direct questions about how much things would cost, how they would be installed, or whatever else. And he kept deflecting and going more generally to other topics. And I kept thinking, oh, okay, he's just a very indirect communicator and he wants to spend more time on these topics. And it turned out what he was actually trying to convince me is that he needed to like come to where I live to be able to do an inspection before he could do what I was asking. And he never directly said that, so I had no idea. And so we just kind of ran in circles in conversation for a while. And then the last moment or note on conversation is that everyone makes mistakes. It's okay just to apologize and do better. I hope that I'm modeling this a little bit by whenever I don't understand Jody well, and I'm sorry, and then we move on.
I know many people have admitted to me.
I know many people have
admitted to me that they have avoided me.
They have
avoided me.
Abandoned?
Avoided. Avoided.
Avoided?
Me.
Okay, many people have admitted to me that they have avoided me.
Because they were very concerned.
Because of communication.
They were very worried.
They were very
worried.
Worried. They were very worried.
They would offend me.
That they would offend me.
They're not saying the right thing.
By not saying the right things.
Or not understanding me.
Or not understanding me.
That and they in the person the realize.
But it's important to realize.
It's okay to make mistakes.
It's okay to make mistakes.
But it's more important to take the risk.
It's more important
to take the risk.
To take the risk.
Yeah, because people matter.
Because people matter.
And relationships matter.
And relationships matter.
Yeah.
So other interpersonal best practices in social settings. The first thing I listed was transportation, because it's just important to know that some people may need assistance getting places, either for financial or, literally what vehicles are equipped for people to get into and get out of. Do you want to say something about it?
Yes. I had a little in the episode.
I had
I had to go to Indianapolis.
Oh yeah, I had to go to Indianapolis.
And a month ago.
A month ago?
And from Muncie to Indy.
From Muncie to Indy.
a back,
A bus?
and back.
Oh, and back.
It was an Uber trip. An Uber trip.
You almost tripped?
An Uber. Uber.
Uber? Oh, yeah, with an Uber trip.
It will only cost $120.
It only costs $120.
However, because I need a service,
But because I need a service,
the transport will cover you
the trip costs me.
because I have no room and service
Because I had to use a service?
for people in wheelchairs.
For people in wheelchairs?
It costs $500
It costs $500
for the same trip.
for the same trip.
Uber,
Uber?
they're not able accessible transportation.
They're not able to transport?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then what we deal with in the disability community on the hand.
A lot of people in the disability community understand.
We have to deal with this
We have to deal with this
often.
often.
What we need costs a lot more
What we need will cost more
than the typical population.
than the typical public option, than the typical population.
Yeah. And upon that prevent us from missing out.
And of course, that means that we'll be missing out.
That keep us from missing out.
It would keep us from missing out.
Reaching
Out.
when we need help
Yeah.
in serious situations.
Yeah, it would keep us from reaching out in serious situations. Making sure, like, just thinking ahead of time, whenever you're going somewhere for like social events, are there actual accommodations to support the person in participating? And, if there are or not, or if you're not even sure what type of accommodations a friend or colleague would need, it's okay to just ask and say, hey, we're interested in all going out together and we'd like you to go. Is there anything that we could check on or do to make sure that you can participate and be a part of our group? And then I just want to mention briefly too that many people with disabilities appreciate knowing in advance either the layout of the location, what types of things will take place, just so that they can prepare for themselves what kinds of needs they may have to negotiate ahead of time. The meme or the comic that I included on this page is by the oddisout.com. And the artist basically has a series of photos showing people walking in line and saying the same thing to order, saying what they're going to order. And the person at the end of the line is repeating their order in their mind over and over to make sure that they can remember their script. And then whenever they get to the front of the line, the person interrupts them in the middle of saying their script to ask them a question that the person didn't ask anybody else. And the last comics area is the person falling over and saying system error over their face because they had such a difficult time dealing with their script being interrupted, basically. A couple more things about social settings. So, facing people when communicating with them. So, for example, like if I am repeating something that Jody said, I try to make sure that I'm facing the camera so that if anybody is able to better understand, by looking at me, that they can do that. Yeah. I've run into in a lot of even like very progressive circles that people perceive eye contact often as a indicator of respect or something, or something that's like necessary for polite interaction. And so I just want to remind people that eye contact for some people is painful or maybe difficult if they don't see well. And so just to make a note that someone not making eye contact doesn't mean that they don't want a social connection or that they aren't trying to connect. Maybe that just doesn't work very well for them. I wrote something about associational versus logical thinking. So what I wanted to mean by that was I recently did a mediation between some folks, and the person who we were trying to communicate with had a very associational type of thinking. And what that means is if we asked a question like, you know, what did you do today? That person might start talking about, you know, chairs, because at one point they went to a place with interesting chairs and now their brain has associated what they did today with chairs. And so they're going to start talking about chairs. And to many people who are not neurodivergent or, you know, process information in a way that's expected, it may seem really weird to ask how someone's day is and they start talking about chairs. But, you know, if you do find something that someone says confusing, it's okay to just say, oh, hang on, wait, I was asking you about your day. Why did we start talking about chairs before we like keep going? And so just getting like having moments to check in with people is okay, you know. Boundary setting is good for everyone. So I wanted to include that because I think very often, especially with certain mental illnesses, people, like I talked about earlier, people associate either actual abusive behavior or poor boundaries with mental illness or with trauma or, you know, just with different types of neurodivergence. And so I want to be really clear that someone, for example, having narcissistic personality disorder does not inherently mean that they are an abusive person. It means what it means to have narcissistic personality disorder. And so being able to differentiate that everyone has a responsibility to learn how to have good boundaries for themselves is really important. And regardless of disability or anything else, we can all be expected to do that. But it's really valuable to support yourself and other people in learning how to set good boundaries, because unfortunately, frequently, many of us do not have good role models for that, regardless of our backgrounds. Go ahead.
And then we're going to add that it's important to talk and the partner with the disability and kind of whom they are with.
Yeah, and it's important that if you're going to have this discussion that you talk to the person with the disability instead of just the person that they're with.
It is not uncommon.
It's not uncommon.
For me to do a doctor.
For me to
go to a doctor.
Go to a doctor.
And have the doctor ask my husband questions about me.
For the doctor to ask my husband about me.
Questions.
Oh, to trust them.
It's not uncommon for the doctor to ask him questions.
To ask my husband questions.
About me.
And
then I have to say, and it's can be frustrating.
That's very frustrating.
Because people might stop them when they do that.
People may what?
They may stop them.
Make assumptions?
Yeah, they make assumptions whenever they do that.
Yeah. That is a good momentum for us to remember.
And it's not.
It is a good momentum for us. It is a good momentum. It is good to remember.
Oh, it's good to remember.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, the meme here is a personal favorite for awkward people like myself. It's the top. It says, "A person, you should try to make more friends." And then instead of there being any text in front of me, it just shows a person who has laid down on the sidewalk with two dogs who are also laying down on the sidewalk. And I don't know about y'all, but it looks like a pretty good party. So we have just a couple of slides on sexuality, since obviously a big focus of this webinar series is sexual violence prevention specifically. And so in talking about sexuality, I first want to focus on guardians, caretakers, and educators. Y'all have probably heard some of this stuff already before, but just to reiterate that it's really important to start talking about body autonomy, consent, healthy sexuality, and education as early as possible, and that this is especially important for children with disabilities because they're more likely to have additional people in their lives who are helping and supporting them, and that, you know, for them to feel empowered to be able to differentiate and tell potential caretakers and medical staff and other adults in their lives when they are uncomfortable or comfortable with whatever's happening, they need to be able to know that they have the right to do that, and, you know, what types of interactions are okay and what types are not. And that I meant to actually include some research or links to this, but obviously people often talk about practicing healthy parent-child relationships as a huge protective factor against any type of violence against children. But I also really want to emphasize that there's a lot of research that indicates that sibling relationships, sometimes even more than parent-child relationships, kind of create a map for the types of relationships people have in adulthood. And so it's really important to take seriously when siblings either tease or hurt or harass siblings, particularly if they are being harassed around disability. That can create like really long-term harmful impacts for folks. Encouraging strong communication skills. And again, this is obvious, but this is particularly important for people with disabilities if part of their disability impacts their ability to communicate, because very often, like Jody has given several examples already, if you communicate differently, people are already much more likely to not take you seriously, to not trust or believe you. And so helping children and young folks particularly feel empowered to know that they can communicate, they communicate in the ways that are strong for them, can really go a really long way in terms of also preventing violence and supporting their own self-advocacy skills. I'm gonna stop there.
I just want to add that Pitmon with disability.
With people with disabilities.
And
I want to add
that Pitmon with disabilities.
That people with disabilities
are
taught to believe.
We are technical beings.
Oh, we are sexual beings.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then it was important to talk about sexuality.
And it's important to talk about sexuality.
That we must tell people with disabilities how we go together. To
prepare people with disabilities to have sexual relationships.
I know for me, and then that, I never taught about my sexuality. My sexuality.
Your sexuality
was never discussed.
Growing up.
And as a result,
I had many bedroom issues.
No.
Sorry.
Bedrooms. And many bedrooms. They own you. And they are
bonding.
Boundaries.
Boundaries.
Oh yeah, many boundary issues.
Yeah,
that's a major mistake. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Hey.
Yeah.
Within my telling you that
around
my
intimate relationships.
Because I'm a boy. I talk about it. I talk people with this that I should be a technical growing up.
Because you thought people with disabilities should be what?
A technical.
Asexual growing up.
Yeah. I was unprepared.
I was unprepared.
And that led me to bad situation.
And
That led me
that led you
to some bad situation, unhealthy situation.
into unhealthy situations.
Today, I want to explore it a bit more.
It caused you to tolerate.
No.
Oh,
That is why today.
this was today.
That is why.
That is why.
I want to explore it.
Encourage us.
Talk about tattoo Owen. Talk about tattoo Owen.
To talk about sexuality.
Yeah.
There's just a cute meme about healthy boundaries. So somebody walks up to someone sitting on a bench. They say, "What are you doing?" And the person on the bench says, "I'm having fun inside my head." And the person standing says, "Can I join you?" And then the person sitting says, "Yes." And then they both sit happily on a bench having fun inside their own heads. Yeah. So I'm not going to go in depth into this slide, but I do hope people explore it more. But basically, thinking about sexuality with intimate partners, it's really important to discuss boundaries ahead of time, including what constitutes friendships versus intimate partnerships, deciding what counts as platonic, romantic, and sexual experiences, what each person's desires and boundaries might be, and also something that I think often doesn't get discussed is being able to talk to each other, any intimate partners, about who are you comfortable discussing sexuality and sexual relationships about your own relationship with. So, like in any relationship, whether it's a friendship or parents or whatever, that single relationship is not going to give you every facet of everything you need, and there's no perfect, quote unquote, relationship. And so being able to have some outside input can be really important to maintaining healthy relationships and having sounding boards among folks who are not, directly impacted by the conversation and outcomes of whatever disagreements or agreements you're having in a relationship. So making sure and actually having that discussion. And then, I want us to think about, like, what do we assume has to be present for sex to be fulfilling? Is it, for example, physical sensation? Like, there are some people with disabilities who don't have some type of physical sensation, but that doesn't mean sex can't still be fulfilling. Or do people think certain sounds or reactions are necessary for sex to be fulfilling? I wrote enthusiasm, and I want to explain that someone can consent to sex. Like, there are lots of asexual people who may not be incredibly enthusiastic about sex, but they enjoy participating in sex with partners because it's fulfilling for their partner. And so in a more affectionate rather than sexual way, sex can be emotionally fulfilling for them. So recognizing that, someone doesn't have to be like super excited about sex right now for it to still be fulfilling for them in a different way than we often expect. And then I've also talked to lots of people who often perceive that if you have a mistake in sex, like if someone accidentally falls or slips and it doesn't hurt anyone, that means like everything is horribly unattractive and nothing else can happen. And I just want to encourage people to have a little bit more humor in their sexuality. Like, sex is awkward sometimes and also can be really funny, and all of those things are okay. This is a comic created by Lauren Brandt, who I highly suggest you follow if you don't. Her partner says, "So what's your favorite position?" And he has this kind of suggestive expression, and she's smiling at him and she goes, "Why don't I show you?" And she takes him over to the sofa and he's starting to look really excited. And then she curls up into a blanket and she says, "Okay, now turn on the TV." Some resources about sexuality and disability, and okay, so let's go through some professional employment practices. I think I just have 5 options or 5 notes here. So the first is about spatial layouts and design. So thinking about whenever any type of space is created, is there enough space in all of the necessary areas of the workspace for actual movement, or for people in different kinds of wheelchairs to get through? And I also included different communication styles because, for example, if someone is communicating with American Sign Language, they actually need a little bit more space to communicate because you have to be able to see each other's hands. And so having really narrow hallways actually can often have a really negative impact on the deaf community, not just people who also have mobility or physical disabilities. Comfortable sitting spaces. So this is, I feel like, a very often overlooked area of disability access, because if you're someone who has any type of chronic problem or chronic pain, having comfortable seating can make a huge difference in your day. It's not just like very basic comfort. I mean, it can really mean the difference between I ran one errand and now I have to lay down the rest of the day because I had to sit on this thing that made my entire body hurt horribly. So it's really important to have comfortable sitting materials available and to make sure that there are also spaces in those sitting areas for people in wheelchairs and other mobility devices to actually access and take space in. And then the last thing I had, at least on spatial layouts and design, was making sure that there's service animal access and safety. And I just wanted to make a note that service and emotional support animals are not the same thing. Oftentimes emotional support animals are pets who have been designated as offering emotional support to a person, but a service animal is an animal that has actually been trained to do a bunch of physical tasks for someone. So that might be physical tasks like getting food and drinks out of the fridge, or it could be physical tasks like, I actually have my dogs lay on me sometimes when I'm overstimulated because the deep pressure helps calm me down. And then I also, just as a last note about service animals, want to mention that a lot of people don't realize there's actually no national standard way that service animals are trained. And so this can create a lot of confusion because people who really do have service animals typically will have a service animal vest of some kind on their animal, and that animal will be able to perform tasks for them. If you ever see an animal that is misbehaving in public, it is probably not actually a service animal. But also note that it's not helpful to people to interrogate them about their animal, because you actually cannot get like a certificate that says this animal has gone through the National Service Animal Training Program. That doesn't exist. I just want to make sure people are aware of that. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on spatial layouts and design? Huh? It's just, it's important. Mm. You're agreeing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Having communication options. So CART services, which CART services are actually different than closed captioning.
Yeah, be aware that someone might need a break.
I didn't understand. Some people
may need long break.
May need long breaks.
Long. A bit long.
Abnormal.
A may need long break. You know how you may have 15 minutes.
Oh, longer breaks.
Yeah. Because it had a bit longer than the rest.
Yeah, it may take someone a bit longer to go to the restroom.
I know I have a friend who lost her job 15 minutes and half hour for each restroom break.
I have a friend who lost a job because she needed 30 minutes for a restroom break.
Each time.
Yeah, each time.
And the employer
And the employer.
what if also will the him.
Yeah, so it all depends.
No. Her employer.
Her employer.
What can overwhelm this that month?
Her employer
What can
wasn't wanted.
overwhelm this him?
Want her to wear Depends.
Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah, her employer wanted her to wear Depends.
That and no, it is not okay to force your opinion
Yeah, it's not okay to force someone
to do something that they are uncomfortable doing.
Yeah, to force them to do something they're uncomfortable doing.
It is not in the traditional end of the typical expectation.
This is not.
It is not easy.
It's not in the
easy when people would be put in the box.
Yeah, it's not easy when people are put in a box. Yeah. Communication options. So there's quite a few different ways to support effective communication. I want to make a note that I commented that ASL interpreters are there for hearing people, but often paid for by deaf and hard of hearing folks. And what I mean by that is it's more of a systemic failing that we are not taught ASL. It shouldn't be the responsibility of deaf and hard of hearing folks to supply ASL interpreters when hearing people should gradually focus on learning ASL, and or our agency should be able to provide ASL interpreters. And then the meme on this page says, did you know that the hygienic hand dryer dries 22 pairs of hands for the price of a single paper towel? And then there's a photo of a air dryer for hands. And someone has memed this that says, did you know this ableist scream machine can frighten 22 autistic people for the price of one lousy paper towel? Okay, so three more things about professional employment best practices. One is fragrance-free and sensory-friendly spaces. So I feel like I could write an entire thesis on the importance of fragrance-free spaces, and it is one of the most difficult things to convince people is really important. But to give an example, I have had a 3-day headache because I have been in public a lot and I haven't been able to get away from fragrances and other chemicals and things in the air. And that I've a lot of friends who have much more intense sensitivities to fragrances and other chemicals, and that often that results in them actually being forced to live with their parents. Oftentimes they're unable to work. And for example, like one of the ways that someone might decide to deal with that, and one of the things I'm probably going to do soon, is actually buy like a respiratory mask so that whenever I'm trying to function in public, I don't have to do it like with a migraine. But often, if we think about like media, most of the representations of people with face masks are like super villains. So I have kind of this like fear that people are going to be really scared of me when I buy these face masks. But I'm just going to try it and see, because I think it'll help me feel better. But we'll see. Please don't judge people who wear face masks. Another thing is just recognizing, like Jody just gave the example of being flexible with time, energy, and productivity. Recognizing that some people might need flex time, working more one day and less the next. Some people might need to work remotely sometimes, or some people might find it easier to use social media or non-email platforms to communicate. And then the last thing I had here was just having open communication and mutually critically constructive feedback. So what I mean by that is, making sure that if you're a manager, taking time to routinely ask people who you're managing how you're doing, how you can improve, and also just community members, anyone who's collaborating with you, have to kind of ideally approach work with some level of humbleness that recognizes, you know, you're trying to do your best, but there's always opportunities to do things better, and that oftentimes the people closest to you can provide some really awesome information about that. And then I had to include one slightly nihilistic joke in here because they're really common in chronically ill communities. And this is honestly one of my favorite memes ever as a chronically ill person. So it has a picture of a skeleton in a tutu with pink fairy wings dancing with a wand and laughing. And it says, "When you're dead inside but want to brighten up other people's lives." So
I love that.
I again want to just reiterate that these memes, I'm trying to connect people to kind of like different kinds of disability community culture, right? So these types of kind of like nihilistic humorous memes in particular are really common in chronically ill communities. Some more resources, and now we're on the last section talking about medical and social service best practices. The first thing, because to me it's one of the most important issues, is that people are experts on their own bodies and experiences. A quote, I'm paraphrasing, but this is a quote I actually found in a meme a long time ago, or someone tweeted or something. It says, you went to school for 20 plus years to become a doctor, and I've lived in my body for at least that long. And both of these are forms of expertise. So that is to say that medical professionals, social service providers, and people who are chronically ill and or have other disabilities are all experts in different facets of our wellness. And so it's really important, if you are some type of professional or service provider, that you recognize that people's understanding of their own body cannot be ignored in terms of how you do service provision and health work. I wanted to make a note that it's really valuable and important for professionals to support people in doing their own personal advocacy. Very often, one of the ways that our society fails people with disabilities is that we're not taught how to advocate for ourselves, or how to work in ways that support us the most. And instead, we're often pushed and taught that we should function in the way that people expect, even if that puts us at a very severe disadvantage, or if we're unable to do that. And then I also want to mention it's really important to inform people of side effects and risks, even when that is statistically minor. If I ever find out later that a provider did not tell me about side effects or tried to push me to doing some type of procedure and didn't make me fully informed, I am very unlikely to trust that person, even if the statistical significance of a problem was very minor. The meme for this page is a conversation from Twitter from @Merit_K. And it says, "Doctor says, these pills will fix your brain. And me, I say, thanks. Doctor quietly says, they might also make it much worse. And I say, what? And the doctor says, what?" Okay, another couple of things about medical and social services. So one of my favorite disability life hacks that I've learned for myself is that if you have a chronic illness, I just want to mention also so providers know that menstrual cycle tracking apps have amazing capabilities for actually tracking chronic illness symptoms. One of the ways that I have found most helpful in my own disability advocacy is actually keeping track of when things start and stop or change with my body, because then I can very explicitly tell providers what has happened, what's changed, and what I need. And it's really difficult to find apps that actually track all the functions of your body and like what things you need. And so I just want to mention that I feel like this is kind of hidden, that often menstrual cycle apps are primarily marketed towards cisgender women, specifically just for tracking periods, but they actually often have really expansive capabilities. And the few chronic illness apps that I've found often don't incorporate menstrual cycle tracking as well. So there's just like this weird thing happening where communities are not given all the tools they need. So I just want to mention that's really cool. And then something else Jody and I have been talking a lot about the last 2 days is that it's really important that as a provider that you're not making assumptions about what quality of life or longevity look like for people. Yeah, like if someone needs a feeding tube, just because it's the perception often that having a feeding tube might, quote, lower your quality of life based on able-bodied experiences, that often is not at all the case for people with disabilities. Maybe having a feeding tube will like drastically increase your quality of life because now you don't have to worry about whatever complications you were dealing with previously. You just have to periodically clean the feeding tube. And so it's really important not to make assumptions about those things. And then I wanted to be really specific in talking about longevity. So very often there's an assumption in medical fields that people will live until whatever length of time is the average for healthy people or able people, and that even people who have disabilities aspire to live the same kinds and lengths of lives as people who are healthy and abled. For myself, as a chronically ill trans person, I have always honestly assumed, I think I mentioned this in a previous episode or a previous webinar, still in podcast mode, y'all. In a previous webinar, maybe this needs to become a podcast. Anyway, so I've always assumed that I would not live past 30, and now I'm 29, and I'm still struggling with what it means to live past 30. But what I also mean is that when I go to providers, I don't have any false assumptions about my life expectancy with all of the things I have going on. And I don't want the provider to negate the possibility of some treatments because they assume that it will shorten my life outside of what I am comfortable with. I'd rather actually have that conversation with that provider. And in my experience, at least, very often people with disabilities are also really acutely aware of what disabilities or particularly chronic illness may do to our life expectancy. And so it's really important not to be super uncomfortable with that conversation because often we're, again, already having those conversations. Do you want to add anything?
That's what in your hand in the hospital in the more.
You don't have to what people?
Pity.
Yeah, you don't have to pity people.
Yeah. People with disabilities can have meaningful lives.
Many people with disabilities have very...
Can have meaningful lives.
We can have many...
Meaningful
Oh,
lives.
meaningful. We can have meaningful lives.
You might look different from yours.
Yeah, it might look different from yours.
And that's meaningful.
But that doesn't make it...
And that's meaningful.
But yeah, and it's still meaningful.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to mention very quickly that I think we're going to run 5 minutes over, and I appreciate people's patience. So there's just a quick link to a really cool UN document about including persons with disabilities in all aspects of development efforts. But specifically, it actually addresses different disability work in many countries, and I thought that was really cool. So please check that out. Another quick meme, because we were laughing about this today. It's the meme where there's a picture of someone with their like cognitive or spiritual reach like gradually expanding, and it says in the first block thinking, oh, my chronic illness is somehow my fault, and then in the second block it progresses to say chronic illness can happen to anyone because the human body is messed up. And then in the last block with like the most whatever's happening, it says God had to nerf me because I was too powerful. And for anyone who is not a gamer geek out there, nerfing means if you're playing a game and the game producer creates a character that's too powerful, sometimes the game creator will come back and make them less powerful so that they can't be the only character winning the game. So it's just like a gamer joke connecting with chronically ill folks. And then I just wanted to close on some really important questions that I want us all to continue asking ourselves. So the first one is, how can low-income folks access pain alleviation strategies? This is super important because I think it gets at the roots of a lot of intersecting issues, including the fact that very often white people have more access to formal avenues for pain alleviation through like medication, And disproportionately, lower income folks have less access to information that could help them do pain alleviation at home without necessarily needing medication. And then also asking who has least access to your space, your agency, or your organization, and how can you focus on increasing all of those things, including marginalized leadership? And this question goes back to thinking about universal design. How can you make sure that the most people and those with the least access have equitable access to all of these spaces? And then are your volunteers and staff equipped to actually work with LGBTQ people of color with disabilities, or any folks who are multiply marginalized, immigrants, refugees, and undocumented people with disabilities? Where are the gaps in your knowledge and skills and your institutional practices, and how can we lessen those gaps to create more comprehensive care and access and collaborative work? And then this is the end, and I wanted to end with two cute names. So one is this little picture of a dog awkwardly smiling, and it says, "When you're trying your best and things start to get better." And then another one is this very beautiful artwork created by the latest Kate, and it's a very beautiful illustration of an otter playing in some water, and it says, "It's okay to struggle, you're doing better than you feel like you are." Do you have any closing comments for the webinar?
Remember the class and the
So keep remembering to push into your relationships.
Yeah. The messy. There will be messy. There will be messy.
Oh, it will be messy.
And a bit outward. A bit outward.
Oh, and a bit awkward. Both of us and the dog on the screen, we're all very awkward today. But it's really okay.
I promise.
I promise.
When you keep trying to get the idea.
We're gonna keep pushing the idea.
The people with disabilities are that important.
That are just, people with disabilities are just as important.
Do not give up on the fight.
Please don't give up on this fight.
We all need one another.
We all need one another.
Thank you.
Thanks. Do we have any questions before we close? I think someone said no. Okay. Well, thank you all for staying 5 minutes late. I really hope to see you at the 5th one. And if you have friends who missed this one, please let them know that this will be recorded and published along with all of the previous webinars and the last webinar on the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault's website at their archive webinars area. Thank you all.